Hello and welcome to Inner Voice television program. We talk about life and all that matters in life, relationships, sexuality, addiction, and I interview with artists and experts. Today I'm excited to have Mr. David Sheff as my guest. Mr. David Sheff is a journalist and an author. And I have to have my glasses to read to you. Journalist and an author of several wonderful books, and one of his books is New York Times bestseller. His book, Beautiful Boy, a memoir about his experience and his own son going through addiction. And he wrote this amazing book that we're going to be talking about it, and his latest book, Clean, Overcoming Addiction and Ending America's Greatest Tragedy. Mr. Sheff also, his writing has appeared in New York Times, Los Angeles Times, New York Times Magazine, Wired, Playboy, Fortune, and Rolling Stone. He has gotten this year's award for American Psychological Association, National Institute for Drug Institute, and Media Award. Mr. David Sheff, thank you for coming to my show, and welcome.
Well, thank you, Foojan. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
One of the most important things in your book, Clean, talks about what is going on in the United States as far as addiction and drug use is concerned. So 80% of America's children under 18 have used alcohol and smoked marijuana or other drugs. And 20 million people are addicted to drugs. 1 in 12 Americans over the age of 12 is addicted to drugs. And I also wanted you to know, and I'm sure you already know since you've done a lot of research in this matter, that in Iran, analysts have said that heroin and opiate addiction in Iran is the worst among the addiction in the world. Estimated 8 to 10% of adult population is addicted, and because they use heroin, obviously because of the needle use, the rate of AIDS and hepatitis C is going up. And Iran consumes 42% of the world's opium, and they're moving also toward crystal meth glass. So tell me about what you know about this and what's in your book about it.
Well, first of all, these tragedies, the reason I call this America's greatest tragedy, and I could extend that to say world's greatest tragedy, is that so obviously there are other problems that are huge in the world, other diseases, other political problems, but there's nothing that ends. I mean, there are other ones that take many, many lives. It's the third addiction is the third largest killer in the United States, but the reason is it's beyond the debilitation, beyond breaking up families, beyond destroying neighborhoods, communities. It costs the U.S. alone $420 billion in healthcare costs, lost productivity,
wow.
And it's responsible for most crime.
Yes. Not
only in America, but in other countries in the world. So when you factor in crime, and then you talk about criminal justice care, and then you talk about imprisonment of people that are in prison because of crimes that they committed on drugs or because of dealing drugs, whatever, it's huge. So then when you specifically talk about the drug problems that are in Iran and in many communities in America that have to do with opiates and now crystal meth, the debilitation escalates.
Yes.
First of all, those drugs are some of the most destructive drugs. They do the most harm. When young people are using, they impact the brain development of kids in a really dramatic way that affects their behavior, so that relates to social problems, dropping out of school, and then getting involved in the criminal justice system. And in addition, because these drugs are so toxic, they're the hardest drug addictions to treat. So these problems escalate and escalate worse and cost personal. If the personal costs are higher, as well as the cost to the economy, to the nation itself, in all cases. And so we cannot underestimate the problem. We don't talk about drug problems because they're stigmatized, because often people with drug problems, I mean, if somebody has cancer, or someone in their family has cancer, as tragic as it is, people talk about it.
Right.
Help. But this one is hidden because we have shame around this. We have stigma. People will be fired potentially from their job. Right. So we're not dealing with this problem that is huge, and it is destroying so many people.
Right. I think that we also experience a lot of powerlessness against the concept of the treatment of drugs, because they call it a revolving door, that many times a person who might have cancer, that it might also go to relapse and it might come back again, but somehow it appears that the patient is really wanting to work with their doctors and do all the necessity to be healed, whereas the addict and the concept of the disease itself is in a way that it progresses and takes them constantly back. So not only they're feeling pretty powerless and hopeless about this concept, but their family members are. And this is something that we keep seeing as I see it as a psychologist or someone who, works in the treatment facilities and has one. So I also see the powerlessness that everyone has. Now, I also know that you have been, beside your son going through the treatment, and you probably went through some of the powerlessness, but you were adamant about it, and you were someone who was really hands-on without ever letting go. So tell me about your experience.
Well, when my son became addicted, I was like most people that I know, most families, most people around the world who are parents, who just don't think this could ever happen to us. I mean, I had a prejudice about addicts and about addiction, this idea that, they were a certain type of people become addicted. The kind of people I would walk down the streets, and I live near San Francisco, and the people in alleyways who are homeless and debilitated, and they sometimes are psychotic. I mean, that's what a drug addict looked like. My son was, a relatively middle-class family. He went to good schools. He was a good student. He was an athlete. All these things that meant to me that he didn't look like an addict. Well, he became addicted, and now I know that this is an equal opportunity affliction. It can hit anyone. There's a genetic predisposition that some people have, meaning if there's addiction in your family, you're more likely to have addiction in a child. There are environmental factors and psychological factors. People with mental illness are more likely to have to become addicted. People with learning disabilities, people with attention problems, with eating disorders. And so, that's going to apply to any child, any person, any family. So I quickly learned that, we were not immune. My son, his drug use began when he was in high school. It worsened through his teenage years and throughout his late 20s. And I began at first to feel what most people feel, that this is a choice, that he was choosing to use drugs, and therefore something had gone wrong. He was this immoral person. Where had his willpower gone, and where had this is something he was choosing. But I began to learn over the course of this time that he was ill, that this is a disease. It's a brain disease, and that's why some people get it and some people don't. You remark that about 1 in 12 people become addicted. It's because they have the genetic or other predisposition to this disease. Now, when I sent my son for the first time to be treated, it was a 28-day program. I thought, thank God, I will send him off, and it was heartbreaking, but I'll pick him up in 28 days, and he'll be fine.
Right.
I didn't understand what you were describing, which is that this is a chronic condition. So because there is this revolving door, in many cases, not always, sometimes people go in and are treated, and one-time treatment works. But people feel that people cannot be treated because it is this frustration. If someone will go into treatment, my son went in for 28 days, came home, was fine for about 3 or 4 days, and went back into treatment. He would come home. Sometimes he'd do well for 3 months, a year, but he would relapse. Once I began to understand that this is a relapsing brain disease, I came to understand it in the way that certain cancers do return. It doesn't mean the treatment failed. It means that this is a cancer that is reoccurring. Diabetes is something that is chronic. People must treat it for their entire lives. It doesn't mean that it's a failure of willpower. It doesn't even mean that it's a failure of treatment. So I began to understand that, and I was able to look differently at my son, to understand him with more compassion, as we would understand a person with any disease. And therefore, the course was clear, to figure out what treatments he needed, to find the best care possible, and stick with it. And so that then a relapse, while heartbreaking and dangerous, because any relapse could result in overdose and death.
Yes.
But I began to understand more and more clearly over time that what I needed to do was get him back in treatment, just as we would do if someone we loved had cancer, which went into remission, and then returned after a year or two.
Exactly, exactly. David, as a family member, I know that not only addiction is a family disease, but it takes different aspects of the family to ignite the disease, maintain the disease, or support it in order to go into recovery. In your experience, and I know that because of the books and because of your talks all over United States, you also get a lot of parents and addicts who come back and talk to you, and you have a wealth of information about what the families do that is supportive and works, and what they do that it really prolongs the disease and supports the disease in some aspect. And Iranian families are very much hands-on. And some of them, I could say, more overprotective of their children, and sometimes the overprotection and the denial that it's never my child, the same way you were saying at the beginning, that it's not my child and, you know, everybody else is doing it, just not mine. And the way that sometimes if they're wealthy, they give money to them, and they want to keep this concept kind of anonymously, and nobody should know about it, and even if they're going to treatment, nobody should know about it. And let's talk about some of the behaviors that you know and you've experienced as a parent, and have spoken with other parents that are pro or against, actually, a recovery of their family member.
Yes, well, they describe this disease, the experts call this disease a family disease, and I didn't understand that at first. I thought, you know, my son was the one who was addicted, it was his problem, he had to get well, and whatever that would take, I would have to support him, but he was the one who was sick. And what I realized eventually is that because this is a brain disease and because it has so many psychological components, that families do play a role, often play a role in the perpetuation, the exacerbation of the disease, and also we can play a great role in treatment.
Yes.
When we see someone that we love who's sick, there's an understandable desire and maybe even a need to deny what's happening because it's really scary. But eventually we understand very clearly that this isn't their fault, it's not our fault. You know, if my child was diagnosed with leukemia, God forbid, or anything, we go to the doctor, we get them help. But with this disease, because of the denial is different. Because we feel that, again, drug using appears to be a choice. It is a choice initially, and continued use appears to be a choice, which it isn't for addicts. It's part of the disease. It's a compulsion that takes over. So we hide our problem, and we are terrified that we will be judged, because what does it mean that my son became addicted? People will think badly of me. I must be a terrible father. People will think terribly of Nick, my son, that he's a drug addict. And so we deny that it's happening in our own minds, and we don't talk about it. So that increases our ability to deny. Because we're not seeking help, we're not seeing doctors, we're not talking about it among our friends and families. And the more we pretend that it's not happening, the worse it gets. We would, as I said, if somebody we loved had cancer, we would get them to the doctor immediately. As long as we're denying that this is a problem, we're ignoring it. And so drug use increases. It's a progressive disease, which means that when it's not being treated, it gets worse. So first of all, there's this shame around it, which causes us to stay in denial. And that denial oftentimes, almost always, contributes to the drug use intensifying, so it contributes to the disease worsening. But when we the other piece of our denial is because we care so much about these people and we love them so much, we also become afraid of acknowledging to them, never mind anyone else, what we're seeing. Now, one of the symptoms of this disease, this brain disease, is that when drugs take over and change a brain of a person who's addicted, they don't see that they have a problem because the part of their brains that are associated with rationality and associated with self-examination, clear thinking, cognition, is impaired. And instead, the part of their brain that is functioning, that is taken over, is the part of their brain that is desiring, craving, needing more drugs. So this self-consciousness that would allow a person with cancer to say, I'm sick, I need to get help before it gets worse, doesn't often apply to addiction, to addicts. So therefore, they require somebody on the outside, their parents, their brothers, their sisters, their loved ones, to help them recognize that they're sick and need to get treatment. But if we're in denial, and if we're afraid to talk about it, and if we're afraid to confront them because we're afraid that they're going to get mad at us, they're afraid not that we don't love them and they won't love us, we stay silent and we contribute to the disease progressing. And only until denial melts away can we change this course that increases drug use and contributes to this disease to one that is treating drug use and healing. And it's really, really hard. It's hard because of this psychological component. We don't want the people that we love to be mad at us, especially parents and their kids. And we also don't want them to go away from us because I would feel with my son, if I confronted him, he'll just get angry with me, he'll leave, and then his disease is going to get worse. It's more likely that he was going to use more drugs, potentially overdose and die. So there was this cycle, and it made everything worse. It made my life worse, my wife's life worse, my family, my kids, our kids, and it didn't help him at all. Only when I realized that denial is a symptom of this disease and that it contributes to the disease and it could contribute to his death, and that I only figured out when I was in therapy a lot, when I attended Al-Anon meetings, when I finally began to understand what addiction is and how it works, was I able to very clearly understand that my son was sick, and when someone we love is sick, we have to get them into treatment. And that means that even if Nick was angry at me, I had to insist that I would help him get into treatment, but I would not help him by giving him money when he pled for money, because as they say, giving money to someone who's using is like giving a gun to someone who's suicidal, to go out and buy more heroin or cocaine or crystal meth and potentially kill themselves. So I wouldn't give him money, but that was really hard because he would be crying, he'd be hungry, he wouldn't have a place to live at some points in his addiction. So it was terrifying.
Right.
But I began to make choices, and I began to understand that I was complicit in some ways in his disease, and only when I broke free of that denial was I able to help him get into treatment.
Great. Actually, we'll be right back. I'm with David Sheff, the author of the book Clean. Hello, I'm Dr. Foojan Zeine. I'm a psychotherapist, a licensed marriage and family therapist, speaker, and an author. I would like to tell you about a seminar, The Power of Two, that I'm doing with Behnam Bakhshande, which is a wonderful coach and a relationship and a business coach. This seminar is about you in your relationship, the most important aspect of your life, your intimate relationship. In this seminar, you will get how you have been behaving, how you have been thinking, your belief system, and your behaviors within your intimate relationship that has created the result that you have gotten right now. And will give you a lot of tools, amazing keys in how to create a successful relationship and how to sustain and maintain it. I hope you enjoy it. Hello, we're back with Mr. David Sheff, the author of Beautiful Boy, New York Best Time seller, and his latest book, Clean, The Overcoming Addiction and Ending America's Greatest Tragedy. David, we were talking about the family and the way that the family supports or negates support or moves toward recovery or against it in a way. But one of the most important aspect of, let's say, the inner aspect of a parent or, let's say, a mate of someone who's an addict is being codependent. Now, codependency is a norm of a culture in our culture and our family systems, because our Iranian family is so, it's a togetherness system. So obviously who we are is a accumulation of all of us rather than the individual. So tell me about your experience of experiencing that codependency with your son, and how did it support him, or how did it not benefit him in that way?
Well, codependency is a really hard concept because, the way you described families in Iran, culture is actually a wonderful thing. We care for each other, we love each other, we support each other when there are problems. It provides safety in a world that is very scary and big and can be traumatic. But the problem is also that that we also somehow need. I think when it crosses the line into being harmful is when we are. It's not just about supporting one another, and it's not just about love, but it's love masked as neediness and a need to control and a need for self affirmation that that we are loved and that we are not sort of drifting out there in the world and being rejected. And so sometimes that love can be overbearing, and it can be smothering of a person's individuality, and it can feel that in some cases when a person starts to use drugs, it can be a reaction to that codependency. It can be a reaction, in a sense, to put up separation from the guilt that is often involved in codependency and the feeling of an inability to have an identity separate from family, from parents especially, I think, sometimes husband, wife. So drugs can become a sort of an antidote to that in some ways, even though, of course, it's very dangerous. And so this need to control by parents it makes sense. I mean, our job is to protect our kids. So we want to control them. We want to keep them safe. But what we end up ultimately realizing is that need to try to control our kids can backfire, because we can't control them at a certain point. We have to allow them to grow up, to mature, to become individuals, to separate from us in a healthy way. So that problem will eventually encourage drug use, and it also then impedes treatment. And the reason for that is because in some ways, even though the last thing any of us would ever want, really, or we certainly would ever admit, is that we want someone in our family to be sick. But we can become what I call in the book, I call it addicted to addiction. Mm-hmm. So we become addicted to our loved one needing us in order to, at least the way we perceive it, in order for them to survive. And by doing that, we perpetuate this cycle. And sometimes when someone actually starts to get well in our family, it's a threat to us.
Right.
And so in a very sort of way that, again, I'm not saying that we're blameworthy, because we don't know. We're just trying to love our kids and protect them. But we have to figure out, and oftentimes it takes intensive therapy, or it takes psychological therapy. Again, Al-Anon is useful because it sometimes puts a mirror on the process of codependency. That we actually are contributing to the person we love, to their drug use and to their disease.
Absolutely. I think that we create a significance around the idea of us being the caretaker, and we've seen this a lot with other caretakers for different kind of chronic diseases, where when the disease goes on and on and on for so many years, that the person is taking care of that person also holds a specific kind of a significance identity about who they are. So they also have to feed it. I've talked to a lot of the mates where when their significant other was going through recovery, at times when they were going through the struggle of recovery, they mate actually formulated and went and got the drugs for them. And at times in their deepest therapy hours with me said, sometimes I just wish you would go on back on drugs, because in that way I knew what I was waiting for. I knew everything was predictable. And now what he's going through or she's going through is so unpredictable, I don't even know where I am in that relationship. So I get it that the significance and the predictability of it usually keeps us at that level.
And also, I think the other piece of it is also just, it's the same thing that you're describing. It's fear, not only that we'll stop being needed and that our lives will just become confusing because it's not predictable, especially if we've been living with for many, many years. But also, we're afraid of being, it's not just in control, but also in some way rejected, because one of the things that contributes to addiction is this, the reason codependence is so dangerous is because, again, we're confused. But my son, for example, would be on the streets, and that would terrify me, of course. And so I wanted to protect him. And so I would sometimes give him money to go stay. Well, eventually I stopped doing this, but to give him money to go stay, for instance, in a hotel. A transient hotel. At least he'd be off the streets. He would call up and he would need, he said he would need food. He was starving to death. Well, what parent is going, all we want to do is feed our kids and keep them healthy? So I would give him money because I was terrified that but of course what he did with that money was probably just go out and buy more drugs. Or if I let him come home, he would be away using on the streets, and I was petrified. So he would call up and he would say, I'm in terrible shape, I want to stop using. So I would go get him, grateful to know that he was alive, grateful to have him, bring him home, and allow him basically a place to sleep it off. And then he'd feel better in the morning and he'd leave again. Right. So that cycle of codependence was not helping him at all, and it was allowing his drug use to continue. Whereas if when I finally understood that I was contributing to his addiction, when I drew some firm lines, no, I will not give you money. No, I will not come get you unless you're willing for me to pick you up and bring you instantly to a residential treatment system, because that's what he needed at that point. And of course, he hated that. And so he would yell at me and he would hang up the phone. And then again, my codependence would rise. And I would say, oh my God, he hates me. He's going to reject me. I'm not going to ever see him again. He's going to go use more drugs. And so it's really, really hard. But only finally when I understood that, did he finally eventually call me up and say, I'm in dire straits. I need help. Will you come get me? And I would say, I will come get you if you're ready to go into treatment. And indeed, he finally was ready to go into treatment.
Wonderful. David, another way of promoting this concept, as I've seen it also in the Iranian community, is let me give you a little bit of background where opium use has been in the midst of the culture, in a sense, or alcohol use, and it's been there for so many years that it's as easy as cigarette smoking.
Right, especially opiate, I would think. Because,
yes.
Well, and tobacco, but opiates are grown, poppies are grown very much nearby. It's smuggled in, from what I understand.
Exactly.
It's a huge industry as well as a societal problem.
Exactly. And then when I've worked with the Iranian family or Armenian Iranian family, that the utilization of alcohol and opiates has been a norm in the family system. I've also watched this concept when the teenager, where the parents want to be the cool parents, and they also think that they can control in this matter if they know that their children and their friends are using alcohol or drugs within, in the vicinity of their own home. And this has been part of the concept of when they come to my office, they say, oh, I know how to control them. In the party when they were 16, I told them it's okay. I want you to have the first drink with me. Don't have it with the friends. And they've introduced alcohol and even marijuana and in their own home. And the other part we haven't talked about, but is the next growing addiction, it's popping pills. Iranians are very much a popping pill society. So in every single household of an Iranian family, there's definitely different kinds of anti-anxiety, antidepressants, or painkillers, or some sort of a narcotic you can probably find there. So their children are also have a lot of accessibility to this kind of medication. What do you think about that?
Well, the first thing is the number one drug problem in the United States is prescription medication. It's killing people more than any other non-natural cause, more than car accidents, and a lot of car accidents are also, of course, related to drugs and alcohol. So prescription pills are just a terrible problem, and the number one place that kids get prescription medication is from their parents' medicine cabinets, and so there's a whole movement here, and I would hope all over the world to educate parents to understand that this problem and to lock away opiate medications and other addictive medications, or to, when they're no longer needed, to return them to the pharmacy or whatever. But as far as this idea that we have that we want to teach our kids to use responsibly rather than have them learn out with their friends, so that, I hear this all the time. If I don't let my kids drink or smoke pot at least, then when they go off, when they go away from home, they're just going to go wild. They're not going to have learned any kind of way to have moderation, to have these part of their lives in a healthy way. Or they think they make these deals with their kids, where I trust you to go to a party, but, and you can use because I know you're going to or whatever, but just don't use too much because it's dangerous. Or they say, don't get in the car with somebody who's driving high. So they make all these deals, or they say, they look at it, as you say, they want to be cool, and so they'll, give their kids who are teenagers a sip of alcohol at first at dinner, and then eventually, maybe more, and they'll let their kids have a few drinks and just think it's kind of great, and their kids think it's great, and even when their kids' friends come over to dinner, they pour a little bit of wine for all the kids, and all of a sudden they're the cool parents. Well, the problem with all this is that all of the research says that all of those assumptions are wrong. The earlier a child is exposed to drugs or alcohol, the more likely they're going to become addicted or have other problems with those substances. The more that their parents give them a message that using drugs and alcohol is okay, is acceptable, the more likely they're going to have a problem, because parents' values have been shown to have an enormous impact on kids using it all, postponing their use, or when they're using on moderation versus excess. This idea that when kids go off to college, if you teach them to use moderately, they're going to use less drugs, is just wrong. It's been proved that the more kids use at home, the more likely they are to use when they're in college, and the more likely they are to binge drink and to go on to use heroin, methamphetamine, prescription medications, psychedelics, all the other drugs. And this idea that, it's a particular problem. With alcohol and cigarettes, those, and marijuana to a little bit of a lesser extent, those are just accepted in some ways in some families as natural, as part of the culture. Alcohol has always been around, since humans were around pretty much. And in certain cultures, because of the opiate plants and because of other, heroin and related opiates are accepted as well. So it's even harder to convince people that these are dangerous. So it's really important to educate people. Right. I've spent a lot of time in research laboratories with scientists who showed me the brain scans of people who are using these drugs, the impact on them, how this drug use over time, whether it's marijuana and certainly opiates, crystal meth is one of the most toxic drugs, so any of those drugs over time impact the brain development. So different parts of the brain don't communicate as well.
Right.
IQ has been shown to go down over time with people who are using frequently. Memory, all these kinds of things that we assume that people who think that drug use is just part of the culture and it's okay, they just don't know, and they're wrong. And it doesn't mean that everybody who starts smoking pot or is shooting heroin even, well, by the time people shoot heroin, usually it's a it has a pretty devastating
Right.
impact on their life. But there are people that use drugs and function.
Socially, yeah.
But it doesn't mean that they're still not impacted, that they're functioning at a lower level. And it also doesn't mean that their lives aren't going to be shorter because, again, the research shows that they will be. And there is always we lose in this country, in the United States, 350 people every day die of drugs and alcohol.
Yes.
And some of them are people who become addicted to methamphetamine or heroin, but some of them are people who just use very occasionally, or even for the first time. They'll shoot heroin because they're at a party and everybody else is doing it, and they say, oh, it's really cool, we get high, it's fine, it's safe, it's not going to be a big deal. And then they overdose and they die.
David,
So these cultural assumptions are dangerous, and they are killing people.
David, and we have about 2 more minutes. Can you talk a little bit about treatment and the effective treatments that you've come across in the United States?
Well, one of the problems is that there have been so few treatments that are effective that people think that this disease cannot be treated. But it's just not true. Treatments are available. They're hard to access. They're hard to access in every country because, again, we've considered this as a moral problem, and so if you have a moral problem, you chastise people, you tell them that they're bad people, you tell them that they have to, in a sense, admit that they have this problem and pray whatever for forgiveness and be better people and ask their friends for forgiveness. I mean, that's not how you treat diseases. So the best treatments that work they're in 4 categories. One of them is the social model support groups, and they include Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, and similar groups. And those do help people. They help many people get well and stay sober, but they don't help everybody. Many people, especially with opiate addictions, respond to medications, to anti-addiction medications, for instance, methadone and Suboxone, and other medications that alleviate anxiety and other things that contribute to addiction. The third category are behavioral treatments that teach people about their own addiction and what the mechanisms of addiction are, and they treat people so that they will not be susceptible to the triggers that normally would have brought them to relapse. And the last one is a combination of treatments. And oftentimes, in fact, almost always, these drug problems are so serious that one treatment is not enough. So oftentimes people will go to see a therapist for cognitive behavioral treatments, or they'll go in an outpatient or inpatient program. They will be on medication, especially if it's an opiate addiction. They will attend Alcoholics Anonymous if it's something that works for them. And these combination treatments actually give people the best prognosis. And so hopefully more and more of these treatments, they call them evidence-based treatments because it's not random, it's not stuff that we hope works, it's stuff that has been proven to work. So hopefully they'll be available to more and more people in Iran, in every country, in the United States.
Great. Thank you so much for being with me. I know you have a very, very busy schedule. You're starting your 3rd book, and thank you.
Well, thank you so much for doing this show. It's really important stuff. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you. And thank you for being with us with another one of the Inner Voice program. And until next time, create a wonderful day, create a wonderful world, and remember, free in mind and love at heart. Have a great day.